G'day. So, picture this. I'm 31 years old, standing in the car park of a Bunnings in outer Adelaide. Doesn't matter which one, they all look the same anyway. And I'm counting coins out of a Vegemite jar to see if I've got enough for a sausage and bread. $2.50. That's the whole transaction. And I remember standing there thinking, mate, 10 years ago you signed a check for a car in cash and didn't even blink. 10 years ago, you owned 3/4 of a business your old man built with his bare hands. And now, you're doing maths with $2 coins outside a hardware store, hoping the bloke on the Barbie doesn't notice your hands are shaking. That's not the end of the story, though. That's not even close to the end. But I want you to sit with that image for a second, because everything I'm about to tell you, the whole mad decade of it, led me right there, to that car park. And also, weirdly, led me right out of it. So, let's start from the beginning, because none of it makes sense without the beginning. My name's Callum. Cal, to anyone who's ever bought me a beer. I grew up in a little town called Nairn, out in the Adelaide Hills. If you know it, you know it. If you don't, just picture gum trees, a pub, a servo, and a footy oval that floods every winter without fail. My dad, Ray, ran a joinery business. Cabinets, kitchens, the odd staircase if someone was feeling fancy. Nothing flash, but it was his, and he built it up from a shed and a ute over about 25 years. My mum, Denise, did the books for him on a kitchen table covered in sawdust for most of my childhood. God love her. I was an only child, which, look, I won't pretend that's not relevant to everything that comes after, because it is. Everything Dad built, it was always going to come to me one way or another. I just didn't think it'd come so soon. Dad had a heart thing. We didn't know about it, he didn't know about it, nobody knew about it till it was too late to do anything about it. I was 23. I'd just finished a business diploma at TAFE. Dad's idea, not mine. He wanted someone in the family who spoke accountant, as he put it. And I was 6 weeks into helping out at the workshop, learning the ropes properly for the first time, when he just didn't wake up one Tuesday morning. That's it. That's the whole event. No drama, no warning. Denise found him and rang me before 6 a.m. And I still remember exactly what shirt I was wearing when the phone rang, which is a strange thing to remember and an even stranger thing to admit on camera. But there you go. So at 23, I inherited a joinery business worth, on paper, according to the fella who did the valuation, somewhere around $900,000. Workshop, equipment, a decent client list, goodwill, the lot. Plus the house, which Mum stayed in, thank God, because at least I didn't have to make any decisions about that. And on top of the business, there was a bit of superannuation and some shares Dad had quietly built up over the years without ever mentioning it to anyone, because that was Dad. He wasn't a big talker about money. He just did the thing and let the numbers speak later. All up, if you'd sat down and added the whole lot, you were looking at something over $1 million. At 23. Now here's the bit I want to be honest about, because I think it's the most important bit of the whole story, more important even than the losing of it. I didn't feel lucky. Everyone kept telling me how lucky I was. Oh, mate, what a leg up. You've landed on your feet there, Cal. And I remember just nodding along because what do you say? What I actually felt was sick. Genuinely, physically sick, for about a year, because the money didn't feel like a gift. It felt like an exam I hadn't studied for. Every dollar of it had my father's calluses on it, if that makes sense. And I had absolutely zero idea what I was doing. For about a year, I actually did all right, running the business. Kept the 2 blokes Dad employed, Baz and a young apprentice called Dylan, kept most of the clients on, learned enough about routers and dovetail joints to bluff my way through a conversation at least. But I was lonely doing it. Dad had been my whole map for how any of this worked, and now the map was gone, and I was just driving. That's around when I met a fella at a business networking thing in the city, one of those breakfast events with bad coffee and name tags, called Trent Ashworth. Now look, I want to be careful here, because Trent wasn't a criminal. He didn't rob me at gunpoint or forge my signature or anything like that. Trent was just confident, smooth. He had this way of talking about growing your asset base and diversifying out of a single trade-dependent income stream that made a 24-year-old who'd never had $2,000 to rub together, let alone $1 million, feel like an absolute genius for listening to him. Trent's big idea, and this is the bit that still makes me wince, was that the joinery business itself was small thinking, that real wealth was in property, and specifically, in his words, getting in early on the right development. He had a mate, or a mate of a mate, who was putting together a residential block out past Mount Barker, and there was a chance to buy in as an early investor before it went to the banks, before the big money got involved. Ground floor stuff. He used that phrase a lot, ground floor. Here's my mistake, and I own this completely because nobody put a gun to my head. I liquidated a chunk of the shares Dad left me, good, solid, boring shares, the kind that just quietly go up over 30 years if you leave them alone. And I put close to $200,000 into this development. Not because I understood it. I want to be really honest about that. I put the money in because Trent made me feel important for the first time since Dad died, and because some small, stupid part of me wanted to prove that I could grow what I'd been given, not just sit on it like a scared kid minding his father's money. The development stalled. Then it stalled again. Then there was a restructure, another word I heard a lot that year. And then, about 18 months later, there just wasn't a development anymore. No fraud charges, nothing illegal ever got proven, nothing worth ringing a current affairs show about. Just bad planning, cost blowouts, a market that cooled off right when it needed to be hot, and a lot of investors, me included, who never saw that money again. Trent, for what it's worth, seemed to land on his feet somehow. Funny how that happens. That was strike one. And if I'd been smarter, or maybe just sadder for longer, that would have been the end of the story. A hard lesson, a bruised ego, and a business that was still standing. But strike one doesn't teach you anything if you don't let it. And I didn't let it. Instead of pulling back in, I did the opposite. This is the part of the story that's hardest to tell. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's just dumb, ordinary, human, dumb. I decided the joinery business needed to scale, another word from the breakfast circuit. I took out a business loan against the workshop, a proper one, bank and everything, nothing dodgy, to open a second location down in Victor Harbor, chasing the tourist and holiday home renovation market. On paper, it wasn't a crazy idea. In practice, I hired too fast. I didn't have Dad's eye for which jobs were worth taking on and which ones would bleed you dry in materials costs. And I was running myself between two sites 4 hours apart most weeks, which meant neither site was actually being run properly by anyone at all. And this is the personal mistake I mentioned, the one I've got to own without dressing it up. I made a call, under pressure, exhausted, trying to save the Victor Harbor site to underquote a big commercial fit-out job, badly underquoted. Not to cheat the client, nothing like that. I want to be really clear. I wasn't trying to con anybody. I just didn't do the sums properly because I was knackered and stretched in 6 directions, and I told myself I'd figure the margins out as we went. You can't figure margins out as you go. Turns out that's not a strategy. That's just hoping. That one job alone put us about $90,000 in the hole, once materials and labor were accounted for properly. On its own, survivable. Combined with a loan on a second site that was barely breaking even, combined with the money already lost on Trent's development, combined with the fact that I'd been paying myself a wage that honestly reflected the size of the inheritance rather than the size of the actual cash flow coming in, it all just started to snowball. Around this time, I was about 27. The broader economy took a bit of a hit as well. Not going to name what. Doesn't matter. You'd have felt it too if you were around. Everyone did in their own way. Building slowed right down. Renovation jobs, the bread and butter of a place like mine, are the first thing people cancel when they're nervous about money. Contracts I was relying on for cash flow just dried up, one after another, like someone turning off taps down a long hallway. I sold the Victor Harbor site at a loss just to stop the bleeding. Let Dylan go, which about killed me, because he'd been Dad's apprentice, and I felt like I was letting Dad down twice over. Kept Baz on as long as I possibly could, because he had a family, and I couldn't stomach being the reason he lost his job too. But eventually, about 8 months after Victor Harbor closed, I had to let him go as well. I remember him shaking my hand at the end, not angry, just tired, saying, "You did your best, Cal. Your old man would understand." And that was somehow worse than if he'd yelled at me. The final bit, the bit that actually finished the business off, wasn't even dramatic. It was just death by 1,000 overdue invoices. I couldn't service the loan. The bank, no names, doesn't matter which one, worked with me for a while, restructured the repayments twice, genuinely tried to help, but eventually, there's only so much restructuring a business with no revenue can survive. The workshop, the actual building Dad built with his own hands over 25 years, got sold to cover the debts. I was 29. So that brings us back round to that car park, sort of. Not literally. That particular Bunnings moment came a bit after this, but this is where the real bottom starts. The slow grinding bottom, not the dramatic one. I moved out of the little rental I'd had in Sterling because I couldn't afford it anymore, and I went and stayed with Mum for a stretch, which, look, I'm 30 years old, sleeping in my childhood bedroom under a footy poster I put up when I was 14, and every night I'd lie there and just replay it. Every single decision. Trent's smug little smile at that breakfast thing. The moment I signed for the Victor Harbor loan. The look on Dylan's face when I told him. I wasn't sleeping properly for probably the better part of a year. I won't pretend I was in a good headspace. I wasn't. And if anyone watching this is in a similarly dark stretch of their own life, I'd just gently say, talk to someone, a mate, a doctor, anyone. Don't do the lying awake replaying everything thing alone for as long as I did. I picked up whatever work I could, laboring on other blokes' sites, which was humbling in a very specific way, carrying timber for other tradesmen when I used to run my own crew. Did a stint stacking shelves at a Woolies on the night shift. That's actually where the Bunnings sausage sizzle moment happened. I was between the Woolies pay cycle and rent being due, and I hadn't wanted to ask Mum for anything else. She'd given me enough, and I just wanted one sausage and bread like a normal bloke having a normal Saturday, and I had to count coins out of an old Vegemite jar to do it. I'm not being dramatic when I say that jar, in that car park, is the lowest I have ever felt as a human being, not the bank letters. Not losing the workshop. That jar, the bloke on the Barbie that day, running the sausage sizzle, was called Wall, Older fella, 70-odd, retired something or other, been volunteering at that Bunnings snag stand most Saturdays for years, apparently, raising money for the local men's shed. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was he handed me my sausage, took my $2.50, and then, because I must have looked exactly as rough as I felt, he said, "You right, mate?" Not in a nosy way, just an ordinary, decent way. And for some reason, I still don't fully know why, maybe because he was a stranger and strangers are sometimes easier to be honest with than people who know you, I actually told him. Not the whole saga, not that first Saturday, but enough. That I'd had money, lost it, lost the family business, was doing it tough. He just nodded along, no judgment on his face at all, and said, "Well, you've still got two good hands, and by the sounds of it, you've still got your brain. That's more than plenty of blokes start with." And then he said, "Come back next Saturday. I'll shout you a snag, and you can tell me the rest, if you want." I did go back, and I kept going back. Turns out Wall had run a fairly serious manufacturing business himself, decades back. And, this is the twist I never expected, he'd been bankrupt once too, in his 40s, long before I was even born. Lost pretty much everything on a business partnership that went bad, not through anything crooked, just bad judgment and worse luck. Same as me, really. He didn't preach at me. He wasn't one of those blokes who turns every conversation into a TED Talk. He just, over about a year of Saturday sausage sizzles, started asking me questions. Real ones. Not, "Why'd you lose it?" but things like, "What did you actually enjoy about running that workshop before the money side went pear-shaped?" And, "When Trent was talking at you that morning, what did your gut say underneath what your head was saying?" Slowly, and I mean slowly, this wasn't some montage where I suddenly had it all figured out. Wall helped me see the actual pattern in what I'd done. It wasn't that I was greedy or stupid, even though it can feel that way in the retelling. It was that I'd never once, not really, sat with the money as something real. It had arrived all at once, attached to grief, and I'd spent 5 or 6 years either trying to prove I deserved it or trying to make it disappear so I didn't have to feel responsible for it anymore. Wall put it plainer than that, actually. He said, over a particularly ordinary sausage one Saturday, "Sounds to me like you were never trying to grow that money, son. Sounds like you were trying to get rid of the weight of it." And I remember just going dead quiet, because, yeah, that was it exactly. That was the whole thing in one sentence. Wall didn't hand me anything, and I want to be clear about that, because it'd be a much neater story if he'd just given me a job or a loan. But that's not what happened, and it's not the point anyway. What he did was introduce me, eventually, to a bloke who ran a small joinery outfit 2 suburbs over, who needed an extra set of hands. Not management, not ownership. Just a laborer, sanding and sweeping and learning again from absolute scratch. 30 years old, working under blokes younger than me sometimes. And here's the thing I didn't expect. I loved it. I mean, properly loved it. In a way, I hadn't loved the business side of things, even when the business side was going well. There's something about having sawdust on your boots and a plan for the actual day in front of you, instead of a spreadsheet full of numbers you're half panicking about, that made me feel like myself again for the first time since Dad died. I stayed with that outfit almost 2 years, paid off what personal debt I had left, slowly, no shortcuts, moved into a little 1-bedroom unit of my own again, nothing flash. And I remember the first time I paid that rent with money I'd actually earned, with my hands, and not money that used to belong to my father. It felt like something had clicked back into place that had been out of joint for close to a decade. About 3 years ago now, one of the blokes I worked with, Fella called Priya's husband, actually. Small world, Adelaide. Mentioned his brother-in-law was retiring from a little cabinet-making business up in the Barossa and didn't have anyone to take it over. Small operation, 2 staff. Nothing like the size of what Dad had built. And I want to tell you, the old me, the 23-year-old me, wouldn't have looked at it twice. Too small, not enough scale. Trent's voice still rattling round somewhere in my skull, even years later. But this time round, I went and had a proper look at the books myself, slowly, carefully, with actual patience, the way Dad probably would have done it if he'd had the chance to teach me properly. And I bought in. Not with a big loan and a bold plan. With savings I'd built up dollar by dollar, and a repayment plan on the rest that I could actually genuinely afford even in a bad month. It's not a big business. I want to be upfront about that, because if you're expecting me to tell you I clawed my way back to $1 million and bought a boat, that's not this story. What I've got now is a small joinery business in the Barossa with 2 employees who I pay properly and on time, every time, no exceptions, because I remember exactly what it felt like to be Baz shaking my hand and being decent about it when I couldn't do the same for him. I make enough to live on, comfortably, put a bit away every single month without fail, and I sleep the whole night through most nights now. Which, if you'd told 29-year-old me in that car park that sleeping through the night would one day feel like the biggest win of my life, I don't think I'd have believed you. I still see Wall most Saturdays. He's slowed down a fair bit, doesn't run the sausage sizzle himself as much anymore, but I go and sit with him at the men's shed sometimes, and every now and then he'll still ask me one of those quiet, ordinary, devastating questions that cuts straight through whatever I'm avoiding thinking about that week. I reckon I owe that bloke more than I'll ever properly be able to pay back. And he'd probably just wave that off with a, "Nah, you did the work yourself, mate," which, I suppose that's true too, in its own way. If you'd asked me at 23 what I thought money was, I would have said it was a problem to be managed, or maybe a scoreboard to prove myself with. Took me losing basically all of it and counting out coins from a Vegemite jar in a hardware store car park to understand that it's actually neither of those things. It's just a tool. A pretty ordinary tool if you use it properly, not something to prove yourself against, not something to hide from either. I think about Dad a fair bit still, obviously. I used to think I'd let him down, losing everything he built. Took me a long while, and a lot of Saturday mornings with Wall, to land somewhere different on that. I don't reckon Dad built that workshop so I could sit on it, scared, for the rest of my life. I reckon he built it, hoping I'd actually live a life with it. And funnily enough, even the mess I made of it along the way was still, in its own roundabout stupid way, a kind of living. I just wish it hadn't taken quite so many bad decisions and one very memorable sausage to get there. So look, if you're going through your own version of this right now, whether that's an inheritance, or a business, or a marriage, or just a plain old run of bad luck, and worse decisions all piling up on top of each other, I'm not going to sit here and tell you it'll definitely turn out fine, because I don't actually know your situation, and it'd be a bit rich of me to promise you that. But I will tell you this much. The bottom, when you're in it, feels permanent. It felt completely permanent to me, standing in that car park with my coins. It wasn't. It was just the bottom. And there's usually a bloke on a Barbie somewhere, if you're willing to be honest, with a stranger for once, who might just ask you the right ordinary little question at the right ordinary little moment. Anyway, that's my story.